The Tender Witch. Chapter 1. The Forlorn Letter. This is what I will say of my home in North End. Though the heart of the place is gone, I cannot fault it. Even as only a picture in a book or a frame, if you saw it, you would believe the place was and is the most beautiful. I do not necessarily include the weather in that assumption, however, or the people. The morning of the letter, like all of them, was cold. I shivered to put my toes to the stone and rubbed my thighs to stave the chills. I left the window cracked above the bed to let my dreams commune with the rain, if dreams could do such things. There was water on the sill where the green grass bowed. The light was still dim, growing less so. The rain had stopped some hours ago in the darkness, and I, like all creatures, shook my head out of its trance and stood with a resurging defiance in the face of tempting sleep. I didn't much like mornings. To wake was to lose my dream, my peace. The outside world beckoned my attention in the morning. Outside I heard the creaking vanes of the windmill, and its ladder clattering with each gust of wind against the wall of the bygone watermill. It must have fallen in the night. There were little bird sounds coming from nests in the thatch of the roof. I moved to the other window across the room above my father's writing desk, where oft I'd sit on his knee to view his scribblings and practice my own years ago. I stretched my back and squinted at the gray thick of clouds and storm from the past night, or what I could see through the swaying of the tall grass. Their dense bodies brood over the pastures, migrating inland like a slow softening temper, growing quiet in the corner after a scolding. The white and violet from crowds of spring flowers, those dearest of neighbors, wilted under the weight of the recent rainy spell. They still managed to wave me a good morning. Good morning, indeed. I smiled. There were some things worth smiling for in the morning, no matter how cold it was determined to be. I descended the stairs from their old room, their familiar bed, to spark the hearth and check that the shutters were closed and the road was empty. Only if the road was empty, then I would go outside. So often I thought to hear wheels or feet on the road and feel myself a fool to hide behind the bushes of my own garden, wondering who would come to harass me. I righted the ladder, got a good pail from near the creek, and picked chamomile buds. My nose was a fair pink by the time I'd made my way back through the meadows to the house, and noticed the letter on the porch. I saw that one of the metal wind chimes had fallen from its post string beside the dimpled pebbles and sea glass. It was caught between the porch planks, along with the homeless piece of parchment. My mother would say that the music of the rods was supposed to ward away bad thoughts. This morning they swayed with turbulent excitement, and their lilting noise insisted on echoing throughout the confines of the house. A stroke of bad luck to find one cut loose. I hung it and took the letter inside. It was an unassuming letter, but finely marked, with a blue wax seal and the oily spotting of perfume. It came as a wonder to me, since who did I know outside of town who would bother with a letter? If anyone wanted anything from anybody in the town of North End, one would walk the few blocks to meet their neighbor to exchange a handshake and courtesies, though I could not picture many who considered me of all the people in town their neighbor. Perhaps it was another anonymous letter of complaint. Now, seated at the polished wood of the kitchen bench, with my morning hotcakes and gravy, the letter had the entirety of my attentions beyond the lively flickering of the hearth fire and its shadows. First, it was the person whom the letter addressed that startled me from my wandering thoughts, like an animal turned strange by a familiar and foreboding sound, spooked into stillness. It was the sound of an unknown evil in the darkness, a malevolent thing with teeth and claws that evokes terrible memories. It was just a name, her name, the name I heard echo in the open fields when I thought to be alone, which haunted my dreams, which had me hopeful in the realm of half-sleep that my life was a fraud, and she was here, her hand on my cheek, her hair bent to cover my eyes from waking. I took a sip of tea with tremorous fingers and felt its sweetness burn away. I broke the blue seal. Flakes of it fell onto my plate. I loosed the papers. It really was for her. Her name was beautiful. Dear Heather. Like a spell, that one muttering of her name seemed to bring her to life in an instant, and Papa, as if he were stoking the fires, and she were here beside me at the table, reading a nice note from a friend, and could turn her head to me and say, "Well now, little one, what's this? A letter for me? Read for me, Faye. Tell me what it says." But I was no longer her little one, and when I pictured this, the eyes were gone. I'm not even sure I could design a color for them. Though I knew the color was some kind of earthly brown, the image was lost to the deepening cracks of my memory. It did not matter that I had lit the hearth or set the kettle to warm or had, like every morning, wrapped myself securely in my mother's coat. All sense of heat vanished. The bitter morning air encroached on my inner bones, and the thoughts which had been lurking in the murk of my conscience throughout the past winter, the darkest months in both season and recollection, resurfaced like an unpleasant bile. The acute pain of her was gone, that crippling dysphoria, but a reminder could, on the right day, drag me back to thoughts of her and him in chains. In an instant, that morning became something unlike any other. What was this? Another cruel jab at the hack child at the end of the road. "Dearest Heather," it began, and continued with a familiarity and ignorance which infuriated me. Enough so that I was conflicted to tear the papers to bits and cast them to the coals. With their memorial at the end of the week, his and hers, someone had gall enough in their customary callousness to hark after ghosts and prick me in the heart. Me, alone for years, with no flesh to call living family or loved ones, no father, no mother, and here they come mocking me with false letters. Not a child this time, nor a pack of them hailing my doorstep and windows with sticks and mud, but someone of age enough for penmanship. The wretched stooping, the lengths to which people would go after all my years of quiet inexistence amongst them, if I had the words to curse them. I balled up the papers, having read only that first line, a pointless and empty pleasantry saying something along the lines of, "To see you would be a breath of fresh air. It's been too long." And I would have aimed surely for the hearth with my pained lip and furrowed brow, had a paper stub not fallen from the bulk of the letter to the table. The crumpled corner of it dipped into my gravy, the stub no larger than my palm and bordered with a similar dark blue ink. It was a prepaid ticket for the dirigible traveling west for Port Floundering, valid for the week. I stopped and wrestled to smooth out the letter. I licked the gravy from the ticket. Against all my better skepticism, I resolved to read. I must have looked humorously torn, as we do when no one is our audience but dear reliable solitude, shifting between a guise of anger and grief, attempting to control my tired emotions, the likes of which had been worn down over the years like any storm-tired cliff face. This bubbling in my chest. I had buried these thoughts of pain long ago, under the heath with my father, and wished them away when my mother's body was not found. I emptied my heart of them. How easily it could be filled again. But this letter could hardly be bothered by my morning melancholy. Its ink could have been dancing on the page. I took another sour sip of tea. "Dearest Heather," it began, and after that was a string of words like lace dress collars and jars of honeycomb, too charming for my eyes. But now, at least, with the devotion of my senses, I remembered the woman in the letter. Mary Elizabeth W. Langston was her name, with a daughter, Dorothy, in the station department in Port Floundering. I had visited her before with my parents, though I could scarce remember, and even now, knowing her name, I could not imagine a face. But this letter was for my mother, not for me. I felt like a silly child. To read it as if I were her shivered my skin with a quaking fever of aloneness. "It's been too long," was the sentiment, indeed, and she bid my mother visit at her earliest convenience. There was trouble with Dorothy's health, a sensitive issue which I wasn't keen to, but apparently warranted my mother's hand. And Otto was grown enough to be deemed handsome, a new son, I presumed. And Giles had passed, the husband, perhaps. "We could use your special touch in trying times as these, the way you once would in the spring when the city was still picking up its industries. I know you never liked the city, too little space for you, but I do mean it quite earnestly when I say I would be ever grateful to see your face again. If you remember, I also have a little something of yours that needs returning. Consider it a favor for a favor. Whatever I may do to convince you, Heather, please." And then back to mentioning Dorothy's condition, something of the lungs, and I could picture why my mother detested city spaces, just imagining the stink of the buildings, of the roads. But wouldn't it be grand if Heather, sweet, darling Heather, came by to cheer the Langston household, came for tea and biscuit luncheon and made crocheted dolls with Dorothy, and held Otto for the first time, since wouldn't she believe it? He was still small enough for that kind of coddling. And Liam, he was welcome to join. But there was no mention of me. Well, the world was quite short of luck, Mrs. Langston, and had been for years. Your enterprise is futile, knocking on the door of the dead. I took a breath after the final line. A common, "May vigilance bear our warm tidings to you," and other balderdash. There at the bottom of the crinkled pages was Mrs. Langston's whimsical signature with its pronounced M, and flair enough to see where she flicked the quill from the page when the letter was done, happy with anticipation, more presumptuous, I might add, considering the attached ticket. I placed the letter on the table, its fine cursive abused by my initial foiling. What was I to do with this, when the poor woman had no fathoming that she was addressing the spirit of a woman and nothing else? No body, no form, just an expired thought. And I, its pointless vessel of remembrance, I who couldn't even recall the soft light of her eyes, what was I to do? Burn the letter anyway, and the ticket with it. I had a mind to. I'd much rather finish pitching the windmill's finicky ladder, bare feet on the rust, lightning on its way, than think any more on this affair. I huffed at the crumbs of my breakfast, at the broken seal on my table, and curled my toes in their boots. I nagged on the strands of my hair until the mess of spirals itched to snap free. What did this Mrs. Langston want? A consoling visit? A rekindling? The urgency of it was questionable. In spite of the lightsome tone, the letter weighed heavy. I hoped Dorothy was all right, as one wishes wellness on the vague idea of strangers. But I didn't see how my mother could help at all. If anything, it seemed selfish of the woman to ask for favors after all this time, without contact or concern for my mother or father. She didn't know a bit of it. I tapped my knuckle on the letter, on the signature tail. I was so accustomed to doing little more than my base needs required of me. This thinking, this tiresome thinking, stressed my breathing. It strained my eyes. There was only one certainty. Heather Wayward could not make that train. I laid out the ticket and letter, and refused to give it another glance. It was still early morning. I soaked the dishes and made myself ready as the breeze swept under the front door. I pushed on the iron latch against the wind. It whistled through the house, smelling sharp and briny. It was pickled sour and sweet, salt tangible in the air and soft as matted gold feathers. My chin I guarded with a scarf, my hands in the long cuffs of my coat, and my little empty grocery basket swung on the crook of my elbow. I headed east, through the sleepy fog that climbed the cliff, and crept over the road towards town. The cliff ended only 100 feet from the doorway, and the yard, or rather the meadow, was peopled with hardy lemon grasses and flowers. No other people dared to live so close to my front door, but I did not need them. My own trails parted the meadow like a meandering hair, wandering to and from the windmill and around the hill to where my father's grave kept a peaceful watch over the house. A stranger could have guessed that so many footpaths belonged to a family. The wind whispered and traveled under the long hem of my wool skirt in a teasing way. It flew east and urged me forward. I regarded it as a good sign and flicked the wind chimes into a fit of discordant tinkling as an extra measure against the tides of my doubtful thoughts. I watched the light glint off the face of my mother's ring. I waved goodbye to the birds and the grave. And then, with the first step onto the muddy road, I thought I heard her name again. It rushed towards me like a voice spoken from right beside my ear, clear and human and real. I stopped. "Dear Heather," she said. She was so far from me, truly unreachable, but I could hear her name. It bounded about my head and danced its way around the yard with the music of the wind chimes. I'd had little life to speak of, but someone could speak of hers. It must have been gracefully lived. I knew in my heart that I wanted to find her, some semblance of her, even if it was in a city of soot and masses. I wanted to hear her name again, to hear someone pull life from the word. Was there some hope that she would know me, remember me, this Mary Langston? She'd spoken so fondly. The cadence felt familiar, not because I knew her, but because it felt like the voice of a mother, someone with love in their heart. But what did I know of the sound of motherly voices? Not enough to be a judge of them. I pushed my hat down over my eyes and sighed where my yard met the road. The ocean pounded against the cliff below me. I did not hear her voice again. Well, it would be nothing but foolishness to leave, after all. I would go absolutely nowhere at all, except into town. I took off down the road and followed the wind. The cobble path to town was caked in dirt and hedged by fields. Some spare wild solenberry stalks lay wasted from the rain, and morning slugs poked and edged their ways through the highway of stone. Along the cobbles was a timeless wood fence, with many notches and nicks. It was of the antiquated brown one sees after decades of rain. It was missing a few posts between the slanted beams, but it was as much a friend, a guide, as I could hope to have on the road. Running my gloved hand along the topside, I walked and hummed, shuddering away the alone feeling with every wispy breath, and forcing myself to think well of the following days. The road passed by the few farmhouses laid into the hills. Their fields were divided by seemingly endless stretches of hilly ups and downs and low stone walls. There were several people out with their cows and sheep, but they were miles off and disappearing into the scrubland mists like unbound shadows. It was a long stroke of time before I reached the true edge of town, where the buildings huddled closer together and looked more like a town would. A signpost held fast by a stone pile stood to the side of the cobbles to mark the crossroads of the meadow plains and the main highways. West was my hole of a house in the mound, before the road led to a string of hinterland villages and the port. South was the river and the forests, which few dared approach, and east was North End and the canyon rift, which fell into the sea before the mountains rose out of it on the other side. But that was an empty place. My mother had mentioned once in a bedtime tale that the deep giants pulled the sea apart by its weeds to break their mountains off from the meadows before the first settlers ever arrived here. But she was known for her fantasticism. All that was north was in our imagination. Dew-encumbered spiders' webs had overtaken the signpost in the high grass, reading at the top, North End. The streets were hushed, and the weary people in their homes were still tucked away. For a town so isolated from the grander cities, it did have broad, clean streets, and soundly built houses of solid bricks and flat-faced roofs, of wrought iron weather vanes and tarnished storm shutters. Of all things to have in short supply, it lacked smiles.